It's not just to save money from paying workers. Unpaid internships, student teaching, and practicums all exist in the industries that they do for very specific historic reasons, and are part of an unintentional conspiracy to sabotage the wrong people from entering fields like finance and education. So today we're going to talk about the history of unpaid internships, who benefits from them and why, and what's being done to stop this, because the end of unpaid internships is probably a lot closer than you think. This is a lot to go over, so please be sure to like this video, subscribe if you are new, and let's just get right into it. Unpaid labor has existed in all places at all times. Subsistence communities have always labored without money to provide resource stability to small groups of people. But as soon as things like foreign trade, a transition to agriculture, or having to protect yourself from other people become concerns, then human beings very quickly shift their focus away from stability and towards having excess resources as a way to ensure their own safety, comfort, and longevity. And in order to scale your resources effectively, you need to have systems in place in order to do that. And so things like schools, gender norms, class systems, religions, philosophies, and forms of slavery have developed in every single society on Earth as a result. But the world is very big and complicated, and so each one of those systems changes to match the resources, environment, and the economy of where you happen to be born. And so it's no surprise that those who already have power weaponize it to benefit themselves and their descendants. The Romans conquer the Mediterranean and then create a complex system for defining who are and aren't citizens so that they can carefully manage land ownership, legal rights, and vocations in the empire. Once the empire breaks apart, people from Scandinavia start to raid the former outskirts of the empire to acquire land, resources, and slaves to improve their own situation. Eventually, the Northmen integrate into the British Isles and form the most powerful navy the world has ever seen. That allows them to expand the slave trade into Africa and export the labor required to maintain the European aristocracy into the American colonies. But physical distance from London eventually allows the Americans to rebel against Britain. Then, less than a century later, a civil war happens in America to end slavery in the newly established country. That shifts the economy of the United States from mercantilism to free market economics, which is only supported by strict gender norms, where men are constantly away from the home working for a business, and women are left with all domestic responsibilities. But eventually, the United States becomes involved in the world wars, and there just aren't enough male workers to sustain business in the US, so women enter the workforce. But once the men return, the amount of women working continues to grow, and the amount of babies that people have explodes. And so the American workforce grows from having 24 million workers to 130 million workers in less than a century. That significantly devalued individual workers in the US, and wages completely stagnated by the mid-1970s as a result. Jobs became divided into quote-unquote skilled and unskilled labor, which was usually defined by whether or not a job requires a degree or a trade certificate, now putting us into a situation where the only realistic way to break into the middle class is to either be born into generational wealth or have two people in the home who are both working skilled labor jobs. And because there are far fewer skilled labor jobs than there are workers available, these positions have become extremely competitive. And it's not uncommon for hundreds, if not thousands of applicants to apply every single time a company posts a job offering more than $60K a year. So what do you do in order to be that 1 in 100 who lands that competitive job? Well, you get relevant experience on your resume so that you can fit into the role while standing out from other candidates. And how do you get experience without having any experience? By doing an internship. Internships became legally defined in 1947. A group of trainees sued Portland Terminal Company after not getting paid for their first 8 days of work. The Supreme Court, unsurprisingly, ruled in favor of the company, deciding that businesses could legally have unpaid trainees under the Fair Labor Standards Act. That court ruling, combined with the explosion of available workers in the mid-20th century, created the system of unpaid internships that we have today. A system where highly desirable organizations in desirable industries, like finance or the government, leverage that position that they have in society to offer young adults experience in exchange for doing unpaid work for a limited amount of time, basically promising that doing so will allow these workers to be extremely competitive when going up against other people looking for skilled labor jobs. Or maybe even giving them the promise that they might land a job at that company itself because they've already worked there as an unpaid intern before. So that's the system in place, but where are unpaid internships the most common? Ironically enough, unpaid internships are only really common in industries where there are a lot of people willing to work for free, which typically means high compensation or high passion industries like government, finance, sports, nonprofits, and education, which are all fields that could ironically be paying people to be working for them anyway. But the truth is that these companies have enough clout that they can get away with this. Like, nobody's gonna work for free under some general manager at a TJ Maxx in exchange for experience. But a lot of people will work for their state senator on Capitol Hill in exchange for putting that line on their resume. But if a company doesn't have name recognition, then the truth of the matter is that you would be for working for them for free, which is why the system continues to perpetuate and work, because they're only really happening at organizations with a lot of clout and name recognition. So who are the people actually doing unpaid internships? Generally speaking, 3 types of people do unpaid internships. First and foremost, you've got the rich kids who don't have to work and therefore can afford to spend 3 months working at Goldman Sachs or Capitol Hill for free. This is how finance firms especially manage to keep out quote-unquote undesirable people like most ethnic minorities and whites who grew up in poverty. If you aren't paying your interns, then the only people who can apply to your internships are the most privileged people, which tend to be people who already have an in into your industry. And if you're in a situation where people who already have an in to the industry are the ones doing the internships at your company, and you decide that you're only going to extend full-time job offers to your interns, then you're perpetuating the status quo and the generational wealth of the field that you're in, passing the money from one generation of workers to their direct descendants. Now, the second type of unpaid intern is similar but different. This is someone in a relationship that is willing to temporarily financially support them while they are doing unpaid work. This is one area where women especially benefit. It's more socially acceptable for parents to pay for their daughter's schooling than it is for them to pay for their sons. And it's also more acceptable in the States for a husband to pay for all of the family's living expenses while his wife does an unpaid internship than it is for a wife to cover all of their living expenses while their husband does unpaid work. That doesn't mean that this is good or okay, but it's just kind of the socio-statistical situation that we have found ourselves in at scale. This is also a big part of how student teaching and social work practicums have managed to remain unpaid in most places, because it's mostly women from upper middle class backgrounds pursuing these fields who are able to be temporarily financed by someone else during the process. Now, it obviously isn't just women in these types of situations. Kids from multi-generational households can sometimes do unpaid internships too, because they have others to rely on for things like housing and daycare. And you also get plenty of like middle class parents who are willing to pay for their kids to do unpaid work for a few months because they want to give their child a better opportunity. That certainly wasn't my parents, but these types of parents do exist. The third type of unpaid intern that you see are those doing unpaid internships and a second job at the same time. I did this back in college, where I was working unpaid as a counterterrorism analyst by day, and then actually getting paid to be an EMT by night. And it's tough to be in a situation where you're working almost 80 hours a week, doing 2 jobs, but only getting paid for 1. When you're working and doing an unpaid internship, you don't have the time to pour your heart and soul into that internship. You're not hanging out with your colleagues after work, you're not #networking, and you're going to perform more poorly than your financially privileged fellow interns because they don't have to wait tables after their shift like you do. And so even though you are working so much harder than they are, they're probably going to have an easier time launching into the professional workforce than you are, even if you're a harder and more valuable worker. Okay, so who benefits from this system? Because clearly unpaid internships are not lifting people out of poverty and giving them an opportunity to launch into the middle class. Well, the answer is the ruling class. On both sides of the political spectrum, unpaid internships preserve the status quo of any field that they're in because they statistically prevent people from entering the field who don't already have an in. Yes, you get a couple of oddballs who are willing to work 80 hours a week for an entire year in order to do an internship while also paying the bills, who then end up making angry YouTube videos about this a decade later because we understand that it's bullshit that we had to go through that system while the rest of our peers didn't, simply because we were born into poverty. But I digress. But overwhelmingly, it's the demographics who are already in a given field, like upper middle class white dudes in finance or politics, or like middle class women in education, who are able to do unpaid work in that industry. And while most of this isn't intentional discrimination, it sure ends up working out that way. But I do want to be perfectly clear that there are situations where unpaid internships are intentionally used as a form of abuse. Plenty of companies out there try to abuse international students who aren't legally allowed to work by offering them experience through an unpaid internship that they can put on their resume without violating their visa. And then startups are constantly trying to make up for the fact that they can't afford employees by labeling as many roles as humanly possible at their company as internships. I made a whole video about this, so you can go ahead and check that out if you're interested, but unpaid job scams are a lot more common than you might think. So what's being done to stop unpaid internships? The Fair Labor Standards Act is a set of constantly evolving regulations around employment in the United States that legally defines what can or can't be considered a legitimate unpaid internship. As of 2024, in order for an unpaid internship at a for-profit company to be legitimate, it cannot promise any compensation to an unpaid intern. So if you offer interns commission or a stipend at the end of their work, then a court might rule that your intern is actually an employee that needs to be paid for that time. They have to provide similar educational training that you would receive at a school and or be explicitly tied to college credit, like a social work practicum. With that, they also have to correspond to the academic calendar within reason. They can't last longer than the intern is learning new and beneficial information. They cannot displace another job at that company, meaning you can't legally fire a full-time graphic designer and then replace them with an unpaid intern doing the same work. And you can't actually promise that intern that you will employ them at the end of their internship. Otherwise, they are legally considered in training and will have to be paid. That is the current law around unpaid internships in the United States. But as any American knows, the law hath loopholes. And so extra efforts need to be made in order to stop unpaid internships. The National Association of Colleges and Employers, or NACE, is the group that heavily influences how college career services connect recent graduates to the professional workforce, with over 3,000 colleges and universities in America being members of that group. Last year, NACE released an aggressive stance against unpaid internships, not only arguing that universities should no longer partner with companies offering unpaid work, but that the federal government should update the FLSA to outlaw unpaid internships in America entirely. They also suggested that work studies should be allowed to fund experiential learning opportunities, like student teaching, for example, as opposed to just on-campus part-time student jobs like work study currently does. And while something like this may sound like a crazy idea and unlikely to get implemented in the United States, a lot of universities are actually following NACE's Colleges' advice, with many of them outright refusing to advertise unpaid internships to students anymore, especially those who use third-party job boards like Handshake that are very easy for the college to control. And this puts a lot of pressure on companies, because career fairs and on-campus job boards are how 85% of internships and entry-level full-time jobs get filled in this country. Sure, companies could retaliate and more aggressively hire through LinkedIn or Indeed to try to hire unpaid interns, but anyone who works in recruiting will tell you that those websites are terrible for actually finding college-age talent. Another unexpected force against unpaid internships is actually pay transparency laws. Washington, California, Nevada, Colorado, New York, Connecticut, and Maryland now have laws in place that require pay to be listed on job boards, with 15 more states considering joining them. These laws have various nuances, with some being more helpful than others, but the undeniable truth is that if you are hiring people to do unpaid work in a state with pay transparency laws, then everyone will know. And that in and of itself is going to inevitably hold more companies accountable. Now, if you've made it this far in the video, then I want you to let me know, where do you see the future of unpaid internships? And what advice would you give to a young adult who's trying to make money while also acquiring relevant experiences for the first time? Let me know in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.